Julie Roginsky is a Democratic strategist and former advisor to the late New Jersey Senator Frank Lautenberg, and Guy Benson is political editor for townhall.com. Both are Fox News contributors. Welcome. Good to have both of you here this morning.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you, too. You know what? I want to play Charles Krauthammer, who sort of sung a similar tune on this last evening in some more detail. Let's watch that.
You've got to ask yourself, this is it? This is what he's spending a week on? We're in the middle of a meltdown in the Middle East, terrorism all over the world, shutdown of capitals in Europe, attacks here in the United States, and the president's answer is gun control?
Guy, what do you think? Are they right?
Yes, I think Paul Ryan is largely correct, and Charles Krauthammer, as is so often the case, hits the nail on the head. What we're seeing, Martha, is a president of the United States in his final year of his term, and he's increasingly recognizing that his ideological obsessions and his legacy fixations do not align with the priorities of the American people. And so what we're seeing, especially in the second term of this president, is just a string and a parade of executive actions and unilateral decisions by the president, cloaked in all sorts of emotionalist rhetoric, which casts Barack Obama as morally virtuous and his opponents as essentially bad people. It's so unbecoming to watch, and unfortunately, I fear that we haven't seen the last of it from Barack Obama.
Well, I mean, the president, Julie, has always been more passionate and more emotional about the things that he's more passionate and emotional about, and has sometimes, to some people's minds, had difficulty kind of mustering that same passion when it comes to things like the fight against ISIS. But he was clearly emotional in that room yesterday. And let's take a look at a little bit of this.
Every time I think about those kids, it gets me mad. And by the way, it happens on the streets of Chicago every day.
What did you think about that moment, Julie? And what do you think about his overall efforts? And I wrote some thoughts on this on FoxNews.com yesterday as well, because I watched the whole thing. Is he doing all he can on this front, if this is so important to him?
Well, he's doing all he can within the limits, I believe, of the law. Obviously, he'd like to do more, but Congress won't go along with it. I'm not a huge fan of executive orders, but I will say he is doing what his lawyers have told him is the extent of what he can do. Clearly, he wants to do more. You know, in terms of the emotion that he showed, he himself is a father of 2 children. Let's put aside the politics for a second. Here's a man who's standing up on a podium, surrounded by families who've lost their children to gun violence. How anybody can say that that's not deserving of emotion, and how anybody can say that that's deserving of anything other than sympathy is beyond me. I mean, the reality is, as parents, we can all agree these people that he's surrounded by have faced the ultimate horror for any parent.
That's true.
So of course he gets emotional about it.
It's absolutely true. And I think that, you know, he is doing what he thinks is the best thing to do for this. However, Guy, you know, there are some very important issues when you dig into these stories and you look at the mental health issue, for example, and the fact that it's very difficult to institutionalize anyone who, you know, families believe could be violent. That is something the president could be taking on. He also talked about gang violence, and I wonder what he could be doing, if he could be doing more in the streets of Chicago and in inner cities in this country. He's in a unique position to speak to people on this issue in terms of families and support and strength. But he's really, you know, he's putting the onus pretty much essentially on the gun issue here. Guy, your thoughts on that?
Yeah. And look, I have no real issue with him getting emotional, and sometimes you get wrapped up in a moment when, as Julie says, when you're flanked by grieving families who have had this horrible thing happen to them, just no one is in favor of gun violence. No one in America, especially law-abiding gun owners. We all want to make sure that when guns are purchased, it's legal and people are handling their guns properly. The problem, of course, as always, that criminals don't follow the law. So when Julie says that he's doing what he can unilaterally because Congress won't go along, that might be true now, but I think it's revealing. He had 2 years at the beginning of his presidency when the Democrats controlled absolutely everything. And they did nothing on gun control. They did nothing on immigration reform. They saved those issues for later on so they can blame them and demagogue Republicans and demagogue people who disagree with them. So I think it's a cynical, there is some cynicism here. It's not just pure fatherly emotion. There is some political calculation at play.
I just wonder in
President
terms
Obama.
of using the office and the position that he has when it comes to gang violence, which, is interesting to me that he brought that up and he talked about the people being killed in Chicago yesterday, because we've heard a lot more from this administration about violence coming from police and the individual incidents, which were serious and deserved attention.
Right.
But the numbers are so much greater in terms of the violence that's happening in inner cities and the societal reasons that contribute to that. We have not heard much from that, from this president, Julie, and I'm wondering if that disturbs you.
Well, it does disturb me. Look, I've said from day one that we need to address what goes on in our inner cities to a larger extent that I think we have in the national dialogue. I will also say that Republicans keep talking about putting more focus on mental health. What he proposed yesterday, it was so modest that even the NRA didn't think it was a big deal, which is why it's unclear to me as to why Paul Ryan is freaking out about this. But, he talked about a very modest measure to prevent people with mental illness from getting their hands on guns. Surely we can all get behind that. I'm not sure why Speaker Ryan is opposed to that. I'm not sure why Ted Cruz is opposed to that. I mean, these are all modest fixes that we can all get behind. Again, this is not some confiscation of guns that Republicans keep screaming about. This is something that none of us can be opposed to. And I haven't yet heard exactly what in the proposals that he laid out yesterday is something that anybody can be opposed to. They talk about how he wants to confiscate the Second Amendment, but nobody specifically addressed his policies, what he's proposing, and what's wrong with them. I have yet to hear that from any serious Republican.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Guy. We got to leave it there.